Quo Vadis is a warhorse in the history of film.
It's a movie that once you submit to the spell being cast, if you're watching it from the beginning, or even if you're tuning in the middle, it's going to have real power. Quo Vadis actually has a wonderful beauty in relation to the times, because it really does hold up a mirror to what people were living then, or what people were dreaming about in terms of their lives as Americans.
Well, it's certainly, grandiose. It's about as big as they get.
This was an era when the studios realized they had to do something big. Leave your living rooms and go out to the theater. Why would you want to stay home and watch, maybe at that time, a 12-inch or 13-inch black and white screen when you could have Technicolor and stereophonic sound?
You couldn't make it today, I don't think. It's all real sets, real people.
It was a big risk for the studio, and if it hadn't made money, they would have been in even worse trouble than they really were in the 50s.
It would have put people off biblical epics for all time, I think. That's what would have happened if Quo Vadis had bombed. You wouldn't have got Ben-Hur, you wouldn't have got Helen of Troy. This was the movie that launched 1,000 ships. This was the movie that launched 1,000 imitations. The red curtain parts, Roman letters, you're in for a class, 2 or 3 hours in the cinema.
Hollywood has been really interested in making big historical films like this about the ancient world since almost the very beginnings of cinema. And one of the reasons that Rome in particular has been so usable is because at the time of the foundation of the United States, Roman history had a very big role to play. The founding fathers in the War of Independence, they saw themselves as, like Roman republicans, fighting against imperialists. Founders of the United States wanted to establish a kind of new Roman Republic that would survive and never turn into an empire and never fall as the ancient Roman one had done.
The truth is that the Romans absolutely felt themselves to be the gods and goddesses of the earth. And I think Quo Vadis hit that. I think it got it. Rather than just being a costume drama, I think it definitely zinged off that, and you felt that.
By the 20th century, when Hollywood was looking for films that used ancient historical sources, that were based on big cultural works, that had subjects that would be familiar to all its audiences, the Roman world was a very good place to turn. And especially because in the early Roman Empire, the period in which Quo Vadis is set, you have the opportunity to portray the persecution of Christians, which was a subject that could create great appeal for audiences in the 1950s.
When we try to comprehend the success of Quo Vadis, we really need to look at what was going on, the way the novel was treated.
Quo Vadis, in all of its versions, took its inspiration from this gigantic international bestseller by Henry Sienkiewicz, this Polish devout Catholic.
Sienkiewicz wrote Quo Vadis in 1895. He was given the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1905.
It's one of the first Nobel Prizes for literature, and he really brought the period to life. Sienkiewicz actually went to all the sites that he was writing about. Lew Wallace of Ben-Hur was simply imagining them from research, whereas Sienkiewicz was actually walking the walk. He was getting around to all the places, and he deeply researched what a Roman household constituted, what went where, and who wore what, and what somebody would unbuckle when they got home.
Quo Vadis just came out at the right time. It was the first blockbuster book that almost immediately got turned into a movie. And then there's a big Italian version, which lasted an hour and a half, 1913, made in Italy. So these were ready-made stories for the film industry to pillage.
I think it was natural that the Italians would attempt this on silent film. They've got the locations right there. They've got the old ruins.
They were big, they were classy, they were costume, they were cast of thousands. In a fledgling industry that wanted to establish its credential, they were class. When in doubt, set it in ancient Rome, and preferably a bit of the Bible as well.
The other appeal in early movies, of course, is the exotic nature of the costumes. It was a way to be very racy and be historical at the same time. If you've got a beautiful woman wearing a diaphanous gown, you say, well, that's what they used to wear. It's just history. but it's often dressed up in piety because, you know, Jesus was also walking in those times. So if everybody's converting, they can be as sinful as they need to be in the first half of the movie, and then they turn around.
Film could do spectacle, and the ability to put within a frame thousands upon thousands of people, as a painting couldn't do, as the stage couldn't do. So this was something new.
In 1913 and 14, when Quo Vadis and Cabiria were shown in the United States, they were hugely popular, and they did have a lot of influence on American audiences because people really love these huge spectacles.
Quo Vadis started it in 1913. The whole cycle really begins with the success of Quo Vadis, which was a huge success internationally. Quo Vadis was the first movie ever to play in a Broadway theatre, a legitimate theatre, at $1 a ticket. 1914, $1 a ticket, and there were queues around the block.
And D.W. Griffith is said to have been influenced, and you can see aspects in his non-biblical but epic film, Birth of a Nation, and also later in Intolerance in 1916, in which these grandiose scales and huge action sequences with large groups of extras, and just the sweeping storytelling became a prominent part of his films.
Particularly with Intolerance, Griffith was challenging the Italians. You know, in the Babylonian sequence, I mean, his sets were as big or if not bigger than theirs. The sweep of the action and the chariots, and they're up on the battlements. I mean, it's a pretty spectacular part of Intolerance.
In 1925, they make another Quo Vadis, and they give it even more prestige by hiring this very famous German actor, Emil Jannings, to come and play Nero. This version of Quo Vadis was not as successful as the 1912 version.
There was a great version of Ben-Hur at that time. Warner Brothers made, late in the silent era, an absolutely terrific spectacle called Noah's Ark. And it is incredible. I mean, you know, they just dump 30,000 tons of water on their sets and sweeps down on hundreds and hundreds of extras.
Quo Vadis had one of the most fascinating production histories of any film in movie history, and definitely any film at MGM. All throughout the 30s, it was going to be made and going to be made.
MGM got the rights to film it from the Sienkiewicz family in the late 1930s. And the original plan was to cast Orson Welles and Marlene Dietrich.
And they mentioned various people who might play Nero. For example, Charles Laughton was asked to play Nero. After the war came in around 1942 and 43, it really was on the front burner, and the studio said they were going to make it in Mexico.
In fact, they even got to a script stage. Robert Taylor was going to be the Centurion Marcus, and it all looked so wonderful, except for the fact that, you know, the budget.
Rising costs and the war just caused that to collapse. So you don't see it really coming back on the front burner again until the late 1940s.
When we look at Quo Vadis, what we're looking at is a portrait of the world post-World War II. At that point, America, although no one would dare call it an empire, was nevertheless the prevailing superpower of the West. We'd won the war, we were the richest, we were helping everybody out. So basically, we were running the planet for a time. And I think that that was a very important moment in which to think about Rome, to think about what befell Rome, because Rome is a model of all the greatest aspirations human beings can have. You know, to create a peaceful society, a beautiful society. I think Louis B. Mayer may have been asking questions about power himself because he was right then in danger from Dor Sherry, who was an underling who was getting ready to push him out. And so, you know, he was fighting for his own power within the studio system. And I think stories of hanging onto your own power probably had a lot of meaning to him that maybe he was not even conscious of. Quo Vadis is in effect Louis B. Mayer's last hurrah. It's his last big picture before he is deposed by Dor Sherry, who that same year was producing The Red Badge of Courage, directed by John Huston. And I think that you know, Dor Sherry's idea was that you could do movies simpler, cheaper, and that connect with humanity more, that are more about issues. Louis B. Mayer's attitude was, if I want to send a message, I'll use Western Union, you know, that. And nevertheless, Louis B. Mayer would always cloak himself in piety. He knew that Americans valued piety above almost anything else.
The project was resurrected after the war, where Arthur Hornblower was still producing, and of course John Huston's coming from Warner Brothers now to sign a couple picture deal. And this was MGM's way of making newcomers, especially newcomers who had a track record at another studio, feel really good. Give them a big project.
Over the years, there were a lot of different directors associated with it. John Huston was probably the most important person who was going to be directing it.
Huston was somebody who could adapt to anything. He wasn't that wholehearted about this, you know, but he was told he would have Gregory Peck as the centurion, he would have the Christian lady, Elizabeth Taylor, and he could have his father play St. Peter. And then Doris Sherry said we could make Nero the dictator Hitler. We could have all these overtones, and we could make the Christians like the Jews who were persecuted during World War II. And Mayer, you know, got a whiff of this and said, absolutely not.
And then Gregory Peck, who was supposed to star, got a serious eye infection and he couldn't appear in it. So Huston dropped out.
Then Elizabeth Taylor is off doing something that's going to be enormous for her career, and that's George Stevens' Place in the Sun at Paramount. So she's out of it. And then Arthur Hornblower leaves the project too, but the project is still not dead. It starts up again with Sam Zimbalist, a producer of mighty films like 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, and he had worked with Mervyn LeRoy in 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, and Mervyn LeRoy had had a series of very commercial films for MGM, so he was brought in to direct, and a new cast was brought in.
Just the production schedule and on the schedule, off the schedule, on the schedule for so many years, it's amazing that it ever got produced, and it's even more ironic and amazing that Robert Taylor finally wound up being the star when he was the very first person mentioned. He was still under contract to the studio when many of the big stars from the 30s and 40s had already left the studio. They used to say Robert Taylor was too pretty. He did start very young, and when you see his earlier films like Camille, you know, when he was very, very young, he is almost too pretty. In 35, Robert Taylor would have been too young to play that part. By 50, you know, maybe he's a little bit old to play the part. I think Gregory Peck, perhaps if he had been in it, it would have been maybe of a more lasting impression.
You know, Gregory Peck sort of looked like an Irishman, whereas Robert Taylor is all American. So that was an interesting piece of, and he has a great hairdo. Roland Barthes, the French philosopher, once wrote an essay on hairdos in Hollywood versions of Rome, that great fringe and the dark hair and the way they wear their breastplate and everything. He looked great, actually, Robert Taylor, as a centurion.
When they did a film like this, they preferred to get as many British actors as possible for these films because their accents set them apart from American speakers and gave the whole thing, to a certain extent, a sort of exotic quality.
I consoled myself with the thought of your death. I fondled your bodiless head, running my fingers through your hair, making you smile and frown.
Robert Taylor, I guess, is just about the only one who's truly an American. He approaches it like Bataan or something, from the pure military World War II kind of point of view.
Fascinatingly enough, there he is, sounding like an American, you know, saying, Lygia, you got to come with me. I don't want this other guy Christ in your head, and all that sort of stuff. It's very, very much like a guy who's just come back from Guadalcanal. And that's very much in the mind of the audience that they're seeing the film.
Behold, she stands with her gown hung loose. Framed is her face in golden tresses, reflecting the milk-white beauty of her shoulders. So it was that Venus stood before Mars, welcoming her lover.
Mervyn LeRoy believed that they should go with someone totally unknown, someone who didn't have any kind of baggage, film baggage, in the role of Lygia, because it would enhance the purity, the innocence, the tabula rasa quality of this girl. And he had spotted Audrey Hepburn, and he wanted to use her, actually, and the bosses said no.
Deborah Kerr was a relative newcomer. I mean, she'd made quite a lot of films in Britain in the late 30s and The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp during the war, where she played 3 parts. The idealized English Rose had gone to Hollywood, and no one knew how to pronounce her name. They all called her Kerr, and so the studio publicity said, Deborah Kerr, it rhymes with star, you know. Like, that put it in people's mind. And everyone said, you know, she's got the Botticelli looks, the red hair, and she was being marketed as a kind of studio glamour girl, really. It's a pretty thankless part, you know. Its innocence is very difficult.
Deborah Kerr has to be a strong character in this film, and you've got to have somebody in that particular role who can really embody that inner conflict that she has between her faith and her love for this man.
She gives a very haunting performance, fragile, a woman conflicted, and you feel that conflict between this love that she has for this man, this earthly love.
Oh, Marcus, you know I don't hate you.
Call it, when we say lust, you can feel that, you know, that she has this real sexual attraction for her. At the same time, she's the Christian. It has to put sexual urges, they have to be not repressed, but they have to be put in their place. She never loses the sensuality at the expense of the spirituality, and the spirituality is never lost at the expense of the sensuality in Deborah Kerr. It's an amazing performance.
They are impatient, divinity. They hunger to see you.
They're impatient. What about my patience? Oh, a triumph to divert them. Who diverts me? I slave, I agonize for them. I have no privacy.
The lasting significance of Quo Vadis really centers around Peter Ustinov. Not simply because he's, you know, a wonderful actor, a wonderful character actor, but here you see a really tremendous performance by him. I think that his performance is the showpiece of the film. That performance is so alive and so mad and so passionate, even now, especially when he gets up with his lyre and he starts singing. I mean, you're just helpless.
Oh, omnivorous power.
You start laughing, and at the same time, you're feeling for the guy. So that's a remarkably dimensional reaction to put us through. And he, interestingly enough, becomes the kind of glue holding the movie together.
You can't take your eyes off of him. It scared me as a kid. It scares me now. Because this is a crazy person. This is a psychotic, and they could do anything. Anything. For his art, he's going to burn Rome. It's just amazing.
Also, I thought Leo Gann was really wonderful because he had a kind of thankless task. You know, here's the handsome leading man, Robert Taylor, and then here's the crazy Nero, and yet he was kind of a pivotal, the nice guy, the strong character in the story. So to me, those two really stand out.
Peter Ustinov's fruitiness is balanced by the sedateness, the cynicism, the worldliness, the sadness of Leo Gann as Petronius, who's just playing in for him. And of course that line, the writing is just so splendid, where he tells him, you know, in short, brutalize the people, Nero. Don't bore them. Don't bore them. Mervyn LeRoy was setting out to go to Italy to film. He called Cecil B. DeMille, and of course he called him Master. Everybody called Cecil B. Master. And he said, Master, I want to know, as I set off to do Quo Vadis, my first historical spectacle, why were you attracted to the genre? And DeMille said, how could you go wrong? It has this elemental conflicts, the sex and violence, and yet the spirituality. And also, DeMille said, how could you not want to use 2,000 years of publicity?
If you take even a partial list of Mervyn LeRoy's films, Quo Vadis, The Bad Seed, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, and Little Caesar, starring Edward G. Robinson, I mean, you know, there's 4 films that you wouldn't find on the same list anywhere except that they belong to Mervyn LeRoy as the director. And that is, to my mind, a mark of excellence.
He was brought over to MGM to fill the shoes of Irving Thalberg. They thought of him first as a producer and eventually VP of production. That's why the first things he does at MGM are 4 films that he produces, among them Wizard of Oz. And Mervyn didn't like just producing. He liked producing and directing, but particularly directing. And so he began to direct, and they gave him prestigious projects to direct. And they all made money. And he was winning nominations and awards for his people in the film, so they knew he was very sensitive to performances. And of course, performances are part and parcel of stars, and this is very big at MGM, stars.
Mervyn LeRoy hadn't made any epics before he made Quo Vadis, but he was one of the great journeyman directors of the studio system. I think he's very undervalued because he wasn't what people would consider an auteur.
Probably the best thing to happen to Quo Vadis and MGM people is that Ustin didn't take this on, because Ustin would have made it into his image and likeness, and it would have had his signature. Not that it wouldn't have had MGM's signature, but it would have had his signature. This film showed off the studio, what MGM does best.
It's interesting that he's kind of available to replace John Huston on Quo Vadis. And he's very competent. At his worst, he was competent. At his best, he was brilliant. I don't know that there was any particular difficulty in making this movie, which sometimes happens. 15 years later, Cleopatra would be the most famous example of a spectacle just getting totally out of control.
I think because LeRoy had been a big producer at MGM, particularly, that he was known for somebody who could manage a budget. Just as Ben-Hur, 20 years or so before, had overruns that were giving everyone apoplexy, they didn't want to be in that situation. So hiring LeRoy, they knew that they would get value for money, and they certainly did.
For me, Mervyn LeRoy was, his greatest strength was always his ability to get good performances, sometimes extraordinary performances out of actors. He started out as an actor himself. I think he always felt really close to actors, and I think he always felt that he had a way with actors. And if you go back over his films, you'll find that in a number of cases, people kind of break out in his movies. I think that definitely happened with Edward G. Robinson in Five Star Final and in Little Caesar, and then others along the way.
Among the pictures he made very early in his career at Warner Brothers was, of course, the famous Little Caesar. It has the famous ending. Cops gun down Little Caesar. And his last line is,
"Mother of mercy. Is this the end of Rico?"
when at the climax or near the climax of Quo Vadis, Nero finally gets it. He's too cowardly to do it himself, so his lady friend digs the knife into him. And he says, what does he say? He doesn't say Mother of Mercy, but he does ask the question.
Is this then the end of Nero?
So Nero dies with a line pinched from a gangster movie, and instead of Little Caesar, it's Big Caesar this time. And that has to be Mervyn LeRoy having a joke, I think.
Well, there it stands. Rome.
It's interesting that they shot Quo Vadis in Rome. They decided that an old studio from the 30s that Mussolini had built, Cinecittà, would be a place that they should use for the filming.
The Nazis, when they invaded Rome, took it over as a barracks, and then when the Nazis fell, it became a refugee camp for about 30,000 refugees. So this studio is rubble, basically, and it's got to be rebuilt in 1946, 1947, 1948, ready for Quo Vadis. You've got all these craftspeople who are great at doing ancient Rome. You've got thousands of Roman-looking people who can wear togas and appear in the arena. You've got the costume designers, lots of little costume designers all over Rome. And you're sort of wired for epics in Italy. So that was another thing, I think, that made Quo Vadis possible. And finally, an Italian law was passed in 1947 called the Andreotti Proposals, which said that if an American movie made money in Italy, if they recycled those dollars in Italy, they didn't have to pay tax.
And the budget now was no longer just $5 million, and they were no longer going to have 1,000 extras. It was going to be 30, 35,000 extras.
It's very significant that the film comes 5 years after World War II. I don't think it could have come earlier, simply because Italy was in ruins at the end of World War II, and it took a few years for things to rebuild enough. So you have the wonderful spectacle of a kind of unspoiled Rome. That is to say, Rome that, having been depleted by the Second World War, is visually there, looking like ancient Rome, because there aren't a whole lot of billboards and doodads up. You basically got the original marble laid out, and all you got to do is dress everybody in bed sheets and get them to prance around and throw confetti, and you've got the spectacle of a city 2,000 years ago.
In the 50s in particular, you had these films that just lent themselves to the new emphasis on stereophonic sound, cast of thousands, and that sort of business, which was all there, to a certain extent anyway, to counteract the impact that television was having on the film business. Many of the people who made these films felt that the way to get people out of their living rooms and back to the box office was to give them an entertainment that was so colossal that they could never experience anything like it at home. I think a cinematic epic is something that has a kind of scope to it, a size to it, an importance to it in terms of thematics, in terms of message.
Quo Vadis to me is a definitive epic film. Huge sets, sweeping vista, a broad story with many characters. It has an important story, an important moral meaning, whether you follow the moral story or not. And it is set in the distant past, so it takes people out of their own life, and it shows the saga of following maybe 5 or 6 main characters, but set against this broad historical background.
Don't force me to choose.
You mean between me and your Christ? Yes, choose.
We could talk about the appeal in America. America was mostly Christians, and sure, who wouldn't like their religious history shown to them, and not only shown to them, but lauded. And of course, as far as the Nobel Peace Prize, what is this all about? This is all about, Christians who are peace-loving, who do not believe in war, who do not believe in struggle, who do not believe in strife. Actually, that prologue that is spoken by Walter Pidgeon does it beautifully in Quo Vadis. He said, this is the story of the sword, war, battles, deaths, murder, what have you, and the triumph of the cross. That's why it won the Nobel Peace Prize. It's all about peace. Christians were for peace. And this is brought up again and again in the film. When St. Peter preaches to the early Christians in the cave, he brings up, the Beatitudes.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God.
They had several audiences with the Pope during the filming of this. Pius noticed this chain that Mervyn LeRoy was wearing around his neck. The chain was given him by Frank Sinatra. And on one side of the chain was a Star of David. On the other side of the chain, which attracted Pope Pius XII, was the St. Christopher medal. And Pius asked him, "Are you a Catholic?" And Mervyn LeRoy said, "No, I'm Jewish." And Pius said, well, we're related in a kind of way, aren't we? We're related. And of course, he blessed the script, and he was very happy that they would do this story of early Christianity.
In the recent revival of the genre of the big historical epic, we have now become accustomed to the most spectacular use of CGI, as in the recent 300. But in the time of Quo Vadis, there was a different kind of technological development that was taking place. Obviously, this is prior to CGI, but there are other spectacular things that the industry could do to show what cinema was capable of.
The principles are exactly the same. It's only the methodology that has changed. First, my father was asked to go to Rome to be on the location and the sets, to supervise the photography of the live action, of the actors and the extras and the crowds and so on and so forth, that then would be combined together with matte paintings that he would do later, after all that had been shot. And he did that back in England. So he spent a good deal of time in Rome during that production period, and then back in England, he took that footage and then painted the paintings and then combined everything together and came up with the final shots that then got cut into the final negative to complete the shots. There is a shot in there of a crowd, and he added on to the crowd by putting in extra layers going up into a stadium, and that he came up with a technique of making these extra painted crowd figures move. And what he did was, since it was painted on a piece of glass, he cut out little portions of the glass and then moved a piece of other kind of texture on a circular thing behind the painting, so it gave the illusion of movement. And he always thought that was really pretty cool. And I have to admit, as I look at it today, cut into the film, yeah, it's a seamless shot. My father is extremely proud of the work he did on Quo Vadis. And if you look at the matte paintings in Quo Vadis, they are spectacular. There is a sense of scope on an epic film that you feel like you were there. And he went on to have an incredible career, became an Oscar winner and so on and so forth. But he would always look back on Quo Vadis and feel that that was truly an opportunity and truly a blessing to show the genius that he really had.
To have scenes in which the camera goes back and you literally see all of ancient Rome, you know, you have that, you have the fire that burns Rome, that rivals the fire in Gone with the Wind, really.
LeRoy grew up in San Francisco where the earthquake took place and always said in his autobiographies that the burning of Rome sequences were based on childhood memories of the San Francisco earthquake. He'd actually experienced a cataclysm on that scale. He obviously was very good with crowd scenes. I mean, the thing about a film like Quo Vadis is it's like a military operation making a movie on that scale. 30,000 extras, 30,000 costumes. The logistics are just extraordinary.
He saw how DeMille divided and conquered all of these gargantuan scenes. First of all, using multiple cameras. Mervyn LeRoy used 4 cameras. This was unheard of now, 4 Technicolor cameras. This was very expensive.
At the time of Quo Vadis, it's about the extraordinary size of the sets. It's particularly about the use of Technicolor. It's about the grandeur of scale. And the studio sold the film on the basis of how many real people were being used, and real animals, and large-scale 3D sets of arenas that were extremely costly in the context of making a film in Italy in the post-war period when very few resources were available and many people were still on the poverty line.
Miklos Rocha, the composer, had been under contract to MGM for a short while, since the late 40s. And before that, of course, he had been all over and done many things in Europe and in England. But this was a big project, and he wanted it. And he was also not only a composer and conductor, but he was also a musicologist. And he had his degree in musicology. So he was interested in exploring past musical things, as well as writing them. We know that there was a great deal of music used at the time and a great deal of singing. And, people were taking lessons on the lyre like they would later take lessons on the piano. Now, in the case of, for example, Peter Ustinov, who's playing Nero, and he has his lyre and he's singing these songs and so forth. Hugh Gray, who was working with Miklos Rocha, came up with the lyrics. But the actual songs were based upon materials that he was able to find that would work in this context and would be at least reasonably proper for the period. But the lyrics were added.
Omnipotent power, hail! Seneca, don't you think omnipotent is better?
Far better, divinity.
There's no conviction in your voice. You disturb me.
Now, of course, the brass that we hear in Quo Vadis, this was a major aspect of music that was being played in first century Rome. So when you see them marching and they're all blowing away, this would be a definite cue, and other composers following. Obviously, if they were doing a Roman epic or something of that nature, they would use that because it would be part of the time and part of the musical devices that were used. And if you've got those horns blasting away, you have something that can be considered at least reasonably authentic. There's no question that those horns were playing all the time. Well, when he gets Quo Vadis, this ushers in a whole new period, because now he's going to do a great many historical epics.
When the film came out, it was sold in extraordinary circumstances as a special event.
And now I should like to talk to you about one more motion picture. And this isn't just another movie. This represents the apex of motion picture making. No film made in the last 10 years can even remotely approach this historic movie. In size and spectacle and drama, it stands brilliantly and proudly alone. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I am happy to reveal to you for the first time some advanced scenes from the two greatest words in motion picture history.
The thing about ancient epics is that they tend to be dismissed by the critics and loved by the public. The intellectuals, the eggheads, don't like these movies very much. Too simple, too allegorical, too big, too bloated. You know, the intellectual film critics like B-movies, which are made for tuppence and they're very, very individual. Actually, Quo Vadis got some very good reviews, which bucked the trend.
In the 1950s, the trade publications tended to be more cheerleading than they are now, so the trade publications were lavishingly praising Quo Vadis and predicting that it was going to be the biggest box office hit of all time, which of course it wasn't. It did extremely well, but it wasn't the biggest hit. But even the commercial publications, and you know, New York Times and LA Times and all the rest of them, gave it ecstatic reviews and really predicted box office success. Audiences did like the movie very much, but it didn't quite get to this mega box office hit that Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments would attain.
Remember the television, it's around 1955 when more people than not are having TVs. So a movie was your night out. And Quo Vadis was created to offer you that banquet of a night out.
It was sold on what's called a roadshow basis, as if the film was being taken on the road round from city to city. So each city had to wait its turn to have the film shown. Higher prices, in the best cinemas, ushers dressed in the clothes of Roman soldiers. So you would experience the luxury of turning up to the cinema to see this event, and at the same time the studios also organised a whole variety of product tie-ins to sell on the back of the film. So for example, the film was also related to a whole series of costumes that were put on sale, including rayon boxer shorts with Roman soldiers' spears at jaunty angles, suggesting that if you bought these boxer shorts for your Roman emperor, he would be as virile as they all had been in the past. There were also fire insurance, pyjamas, wallpaper, even hairstyles. This was quite a common feature of films in that period, to sell that kind of sometimes quite intimate merchandising, so that in the end your house could look like Nero's palace and you too could look like a Roman soldier.
The film was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and even 2 acting honors, Leo Genn as well as Peter Ustinov.
Usually with biblical or Roman epics, the Oscars that they're nominated for are either production design, cinematography, editing and music, or Best Supporting Actor. You don't often get Best Film or Best Actor from these films, but this is no exception. 2 Best Supporting Actors competing with it. And this was a class production. You know, it was the kind of production that at Academy Award time, people like to shower with nominations and so on, and it becomes part of the selling point for it. This is class.
Roche's score for Quo Vadis was nominated for an Academy Award, but didn't win. But he did get 2 before that, for Spellbound and for Double Life. And then, of course, Ben-Hur, several years later, he won. So this was in the foreground and the forerunner of these big epics that were coming along. And there were so many of them in the 50s. And they were, you know, mostly well regarded because there was a market for this sort of thing.
More singing! Why aren't they afraid? They irritate me. They should have been tortured first, their insolence destroyed.
Cecil B. DeMille's Samson and Delilah in 1949 and Mervyn LeRoy and Sam Zimbalist's Quo Vadis in '51 kicked off the golden age of the historical spectacle, both religious and secular, so it's very, very important. It's very hard to capture spirituality on film because film is so concrete and spirituality is such an abstract thing. So many these historical spectacles, the religious ones, don't have is, of course, spirituality. And there is a spirituality going through, that is felt through Quo Vadis, you do get a sense that I'm gonna be better.
This kind of film about the lives of the early Christians and their persecution in Rome was very much of its time. There are a lot of films like this produced in the 1950s, like The Robe, like Demetrius and the Gladiators, and they spoke to a rise of interest in attending church, in Christian fundamentalism, in the conflict that America perceived itself as being in against the godlessness of the Soviet Union.
The ending. Robert Taylor, a centurion, talking to one of his colleagues, and they're discussing what will the future hold.
Babylon, Egypt, Greece, Rome. What follows?
A more permanent world, I hope. Or a more permanent faith.
And you think to yourself, yes, that's partly about Christianity, but it's also about the Marshall Plan, America and Europe, stability, economic stability, political stability against communism on the one hand and fascism on the other hand, a more permanent solution to Europe's stability.
In the 1960s, the epic film really started to fall out of favor pretty quickly. And by the time you get to the mid to late 60s, people are more interested in the counterculture films, in Easy Rider, and these sort of newer films with young directors who are making films on a shoestring.
Gladiator was the first one that had been made since the 60s. There's a lot of them on television now. There's a lot of mini-series, but you know, it's doing the opposite of what it once had done. Now it's all on television instead of what drew people from their televisions.
Of course they'd seen Quo Vadis, and in fact, when one day we were sitting around at DreamWorks carrying on some, I can't remember what the story meeting was, it was going on forever, and on this giant screen behind us, Quo Vadis was running without sound. So every now and then we'd look up and get re-energized, yes, we can do it, they did it, we can do it, you know.
I think because more and more people are curious now about that period of the late 40s, early 50s. A lot of unmapped movies, so to speak, are returning to the surface after years of being buried by, you know, more contemporary distractions. And so I think Quo Vadis is actually coming back into its own.
Quo Vadis as a novel and the film versions not only entertain us but instruct us and show us not a picture of man as he is, but a picture of what man can be as well. It's our humanity at its noblest and at its worst. What a spectrum. And boy, do we need a Quo Vadis today, especially in terms of showing us the noblest and showing us in terms of what man could be.